Hi there, everyone. This is Steve Lodin. I'm currently the Cybersecurity Operations Team Director at Sallie Mae. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our experiences as we moved our bank 100% into the cloud. And you're probably thinking, you don't believe me when I say 100%. And okay, you might be accurate. It's probably 4 or 5 nines into the cloud. We have essentially all of our data center assets except for a couple of appliances sitting in a colo. I'm going to briefly discuss our journey along the way and some of the gotchas and lessons learned in the process. So I don't know if this is going to work. We'll give it a shot, but if you guys could use the chat button and let me know where you're at in the process. If you're a newbie just learning about the cloud, go ahead and let me know. If you're dipping your toes in the water, you have some stuff in the cloud, maybe 1 or 2 different cloud providers, let me know. And then if you're fully in like us, I'm definitely interested in knowing who you are. Hopefully I get this later. We'll see how that works. All right, so in terms of what I'm going to talk about, basically, I'm going to give you some background of the company, why we ended up in 100% in the cloud along the way. Talk a little bit about the golden rules that we agreed upon as our security foundation. And then some of the observations we had in that migration process, including gotcha, surprises, lessons learned. And then what's up next, meaning what are we doing right now post the migration? We are a fast follower. We're not the first 100% in the cloud. We're not the first bank 100% in the cloud. I think we're the second. And along the way, we definitely felt like we were the first. There were so many different solutions and processes in place that seemed like we were doing it for the first time. So a little bit on Sallie Mae. For those of you in Indianapolis, you might have seen us. We existed before our split up on I-69. In 2014, basically, we split the company into 2 different separate companies. Sallie Mae was split into Navient and Sallie Mae. Navient is the federal student loan processing and a few other businesses for collections. Sallie Mae itself, that does private student loans, a bank, internet bank, You-Promise Rewards program, and now credit cards was separate. We, in this process, we also, in 2019, did a little bit of brand change, and we brought in the credit cards in 2019, so we've made a few company changes since then. In terms of the process, when we were old Sallie Mae, we had everything on-prem in a data center with the concept that we did not allow anything off-prem in the cloud. When we made the split in 2014, we basically moved all of our data center assets out of an on-prem environment to this new company in a managed data center. We were using a managed data center provider. We had a non-production environment in Washington, D.C., and we had our production environment in Chicago. Those data center environments were largely virtual machines, but there were a few physical servers. Some of those standalone physicals, for example, we had a large implementation of our enterprise data warehouse that had, I don't know, petabytes of physical disk storage. From the security perspective, most of our security stack involved appliances and consoles, and we're in the colo portion of the managed data center. In 2019, we ended up moving all of those assets, except for basically 2, into Amazon. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that process. What's up next? Well, rainbows and unicorns in the cloud for us. So Sallie Mae is a bank. We are in the top 100 in terms of size of banks. We do offer in our internet banking CDs and market money market accounts that the rate's pretty good. We show up on a lot of different lists as having a good way to make money pre-coronavirus. One of the terms that we use a lot with our company developers and company business side is, let me remind you that we are a bank. So we have a lot of regulation applying to us. We have multiple annual regulatory audits to make sure that we're meeting our obligation as a bank. And of course, it's probably no secret, but our regulator is the FDIC. So you guys are familiar with them as well. All right. In the process of moving everything to the cloud, we have basically a set of systems that we ended up moving. We utilize third-party and hosted services and internally developed applications. Our internal and external primarily used our existing platforms. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec. Our uPromise rewards program was migrated out of essentially data center assets into Salesforce.com. And we started up our company 3-tier credit card using a fintech credit card platform that we've helped provide funding for, along with Goldman Sachs. In terms of data centers, we eventually ended up choosing to move all of our VMs in our managed data center into the EC2 IaaS environment in AWS. We did a lift and shift migration strategy. So that basically means we took the virtual machines and a few of the physicals, migrated them out of the managed data center, took off the managed data center provider tools, put on our own tools, created images, and moved those into AWS. Today, we're largely one region as our primary, and then a second region as our replicated data and server templates for our DR. Other infrastructure, we do have telephony for our call center hosted by a third party. When we made the split in 2014, Cloud SaaS was now a newfound environment for us to solve problems. So we use the traditional Cloud SaaS environments for Workday for HR, ServiceNow for ticketing, Office 365. So Cloud SaaS is definitely part of our blood these days. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about, in the process of doing this migration, the golden rules that we used. And before I get onto that point, I want to talk about the struggles that we faced in doing this. We're a legacy company, so we have a lot of applications running on servers. The other thing that really that we struggled with in this process was getting our regulator buy-in, making sure that our internal risk environment, risk managers, and internal audit had acceptance. From our perspective, we wanted to make sure that we increased our visibility and maintained our defense in depth security stack as we moved along. The process in making the migration took us about, in picking up a VM and moving it over, about, I don't know, 3 or 4 months, and largely in a month or two was most of the work. First couple months were testing and making sure that the process worked. But that was just the movement. We spent probably 2 years in the process talking with our regulators. We went through a very dip your toes in water approach. We convinced them that we would do the right things regarding our regulatory compliance and our control environment. We did a test in Azure. Then through the process in deciding where our assets were going to end up, we switched from Azure over to AWS. Our next test went in AWS. We moved www.salliemae.com into AWS. And then we made the full commitment to move everything there. For us, we're really trying to make sure that we prove we're safe and protected and following compliance and meeting our traditional audit control environment. and making sure that our security tools worked as advertised. So in terms of golden rules, basically we wanted to make sure in this change that our IT systems were harder to penetrate. And a couple of the rules we put around that, we wanted to make sure that we protected administrator access with a software-defined perimeter solution. We want to implement microsegmentation to protect applications from unnecessary access and to prevent lateral movement within the accounts. We did perform basic hygiene in Amazon. We ensured that there were no public S3 buckets. We made sure that security groups weren't over-permissioned. We had a strong IAM team stood up to make sure that roles and responsibilities throughout the Amazon environment were well maintained. We also took the opportunity to take the CIS benchmarks and start to apply those to the environments. Immutability, golden AMIs, all of those things make it much easier to get and maintain a secure infrastructure. From our perspective, we also made sure that we put MFA on our cloud administrator accounts. So if you want access to the essentially AWS root account, you got to come in and go through a process to get the hard token MFA. All right. We also wanted to make sure that our IT systems and data were harder to pwn. So we took this concept of encrypt basically everywhere. So everything's encrypted at rest in Amazon on the data stores. We make sure that the data in transit, in motion, is being encrypted. A lot of TLS. We're using DLP where possible. We wanted to make sure that we had a common security framework for all generated servers. So infrastructure as code is basically a key piece to this. We also wanted to make sure that there were really no snowflakes. I think I mentioned this elsewhere, but we did not want to have these individual, I'm special, I need something different type environments, because those are harder to manage and control and keep track of. And don't work well when you're using infrastructure as code. We also wanted to make sure that we protect our administrator accounts and privileges. And in this particular case, heard this mentioned previously in another earlier presentation, but for us, Capital One was definitely a warning shot across the bow. When Capital One, who is known as a definite first comer in the cloud and also does a decent job of security, lost an S3 bucket, that definitely made us go back and take a look at all of the different steps in the exploit process and make sure they didn't apply to us. In this particular case, in protecting accounts and privileges, the asterisk in AWS rules is definitely a gotcha. We also wanted to make sure that attacks were harder to conceal. In this particular case, we wanted better logs, and we wanted to centralize those logs and get them off to our tools. We also wanted to make sure that our cloud operations were, our cloud infrastructure and cloud operations were set up and managed in a compliant framework. We do have one of those tools listed above that, since they were listed there, have all been bought by other companies. So Checkpoint owns Dome9, Palo Alto owns Redlock and Evident.io. I think Sophos owns Avid Secure. So everybody's trying to get into the cloud environment by buying these cloud operational tools. We also wanted to make sure that if an attack or a compromise were to happen, they're easier to recover from. So we want to ensure that our forensics tools are on all EC2s. We want to make sure that systems and backups are recoverable. We want to make sure that we can use, where possible, immutable systems, and use a blue-green implementation to basically allow for in-place system updates and OS patching. All right, so before we went live, we wanted to make sure that we had our operational foundations in place. We want to automate and use infrastructure as code as much as possible. That's definitely a driver for us. We wanted to eliminate, in the security side, eliminate all these console servers that we had. So we took the process of basically cloudifying the security solutions we had in place. Consoles went to the cloud. In some cases, we used a different solution and a SaaS application. We also, in this process, made sure that there were, again, no changes in the lift and shift environment. We didn't want to combine application changes at the same time we were moving the VMs. And as I mentioned earlier, no special snowflakes. What that no change environment meant for us in the process was we had some poorly supported operating systems that had to be, hang around for a little bit while longer. So for example, Red Hat Linux 5. While we had extended support, we did not make the change to 6 or 7 while doing the lift and shift. All right, so on the migration side, I'm going to give you some observations, probably not run through all of them in the constraint of time, but some of the gotchas that we encountered. In this process, we noticed that you had to have good operational logging prior to making the process, because when you move something and it breaks, you need to be able to figure out why, what broke. In some cases, we had to use our SIM tool, security information event monitoring tool, as that operational logging tool to figure out what got blocked or what the log messages were coming from the systems. We also noticed that AWS security groups, they do provide kind of a tier 1 firewall capability, but they are definitely not a next generation application security firewall. They're kind of like a first generation Cisco PICs. They are not application aware. They're not user aware. You can't send stuff off to a sandbox for detonation. You can't filter based on reputation or geo-blocking. So it was definitely not a firewall in our perspective there. Let me go back, sorry, previous. We also went from a fairly robust and mature load balancing environment using F5s and I rules to consider AWS load balancers. And again, that did not have the application load balancer requirements that we were looking for to just go native. So both, while we use a lot of security groups, that's not the only tool we use for perimeter and endpoint protection. We also do not just use load balancers as our security and balancing solution. The other thing we encountered on this is the process of moving systems is complex. It takes a lot of people to make this happen. We also wanted to make sure we were doing it right and tried to get compliance testing and evidence gathering during the migration. And that was a challenge, getting evidence at the same time as you're dealing with tier 1 existing and planning for the next set of systems to be migrated was a challenge on our side. A surprise for us, and this changes, I don't know, weekly by Amazon, so I'm not going to guarantee this is exactly correct, but we did learn that security groups have limits. A typical firewall might have 3,000 to 10,000 rules. In Amazon, for security groups, you can have 5 security groups per network interface, and each of those security groups can have 60 inbound and 60 outbound rules per group. And so when we were trying to do our micro-segmentation, we encountered difficulties in getting all the rules in place that we needed, especially with things like shared services, Active Directory, DNS, logging, security agent communication, operational agent communication. And so we had to do a bunch of essentially roll-up rules, generalize more, and use bigger CIDRs in the rules than desired. And that had a negative impact on our microsegmentation goal. One of the other things that we have is the need to have a network IDS, IPS, especially for PCI. And at the time we were doing this migration, the span port capability or a tapping capability did not exist in Amazon. Since then, they've released AWS Mirror. But we needed to have basically a story to meet our regulatory controls like PCI. Other companies that we communicated with would consider using hairpinning, send all of their traffic off to a colo, run it through their security stack, and then send the traffic back. We chose not to go through that difficulty of managing another colo environment like that. We, in this process, we were, as I mentioned earlier, surprised that it seemed like many of these security vendors had not experienced environments fully in the cloud. They may have worked with a lot of hybrid environments. For us, we encountered many times where it felt like we were helping coach them through getting things set up in the cloud, especially with infrastructure as code. One of the other pleasant surprises that we ended up with that had an impact in our bottom line, though, was our security visibility definitely increased. When you consider VPC flow logs on everything that's happening in Amazon, visibility on the network layer for us went from a tiny little bit to fire hose wide open. So the impact for us was that we have a EPS, events per second driven tool for our SIM, and our events per second went from in the managed data center. Essentially, we went events per day, 1 billion, to events per day to 2 billion. So we had to up our events per second to support that newly found visibility in our environment. All right, some of the lessons we learned. If you're going to make a move to Amazon in an all-out lift and shift model, don't combine that with other major IT changes at the same time, largely because of resource availability. If you're trying to have people manage the migration and also participate in other major changes, you lose people. So for us, we helped avoid that or remediate that by bringing in contractors, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Definitely start small, automate where possible, and make sure that you properly size your assets. Early on, we were doing database testing in the migration. We built a database server way overpowered and oversized to test some piece of the process, and forgot to undo that and ended up paying a little bit extra. One of the other observations, and we've seen this with other companies that have a lot of Amazon assets, is start from the beginning. Don't allow any cloud asset infrastructure accounts outside your managed accounts under your corporate billing. I have heard other companies here in town that are discovering new Amazon accounts on a weekly basis. For us, using our strong vendor management program, using our strong procurement, and also corporate credit card management, that is not happening for us. So we're confident that all the accounts that have Sallie Mae assets and data are managed well. We also made sure that we put in a governance process around AWS as a whole. We have a request and approval process using ServiceNow. We are manually working on cost management. The cloud management platforms that we looked at did not seem mature. So right now that's a management environment on our own side. We definitely implemented least privileges, separation of duty, strong IAM roles. in this governance process. We're trying to do automation as much as we can. And we went through a pretty strong environment change and setup to make sure that we were developing our controls at the same time as we were building this. We initially thought, well, this is the cloud, this is different than on-prem, we're gonna need whole new controls to manage the environment. In reality, the controls that we use in our unified control framework are all the same, we just have different ways of gathering evidence. So not really any change there. The other piece that we learned is that when you're doing the migration, make sure that your tagging is accurate, because whatever you're going to use tagging for in your infrastructure as code, in your ownership, cost center, all of that stuff needs accurate tagging. For us on the security side, we need to know who owns an EC2 so that we can send vulnerabilities to the right team. Or if we have an incident on a server, we need to know who to contact to make sure that they're involved in the incident response process. All right, another set of lessons learned. We went through a pretty extensive training of all of our developers, security team, even our auditors in this process. The training that you get from Amazon assumes that you have an open environment and that everybody has full privileges to do everything. So when they then get their hands in your own environment and they can't do certain things because of restrictions, guardrails, and guidelines, there was some frustration there. We still have some challenges in the development environment. What's a sandbox? What can you have in the sandbox? Who has access? How many privileges do they have? What can they spin up? Does it have connectivity back to production? What data is available? Is it linked into Active Directory or the whole environment? So we're still dealing with challenges in sandboxing. In the process, when we got contractors, we also encountered skill issues in the contractors. We had many times where we questioned the resumes that we got, and they were not always accurate. So finding competent AWS skills is a challenge. We encountered that here locally, and then when people outside of Indianapolis were brought in, we also had that same difficulty in validating that their AWS skills were real and could work in our environment. Another lesson learned, make sure that compliance is involved early on, and that you plan, if you're a compliance-driven, regulatory-driven environment, that you plan for extra time in the migration process. We also learned that change management, if you're also strongly in the change management environment, don't abandon that, keep that in place, make sure that you build automation and infrastructure as code as part of that, but keep your change management. And also we have the concept of don't trust the backlog. So it's real easy to not basically do everything in the process, make assumptions, or put stuff in the backlog to get done later. If you're not managing that backlog strictly with enforced deadlines, then a lot of stuff will get forgotten. All right, in our process, we encountered some strategic changes. I'll kind of outline a few of those. Early on, we basically made this change from Azure to AWS. We are a .NET self-developed application environment, so our initial thoughts were that Azure fit with Windows-based .NET environments. We are also using VSTS, now active, no, it's ADO. We're using ADO as our pipeline. So we originally thought Azure was the right data center or right cloud provider to go to. We ended up, after some long discussions, choosing AWS. So from the security side, we were planning how to implement OMS and all the tools that Microsoft has, and then we had to pivot into AWS and trying to evaluate all of the native security tools that Amazon has. We did have early involvement with our regulators. We did not have any requirements, so we had to establish the strategy on how we're going to maintain the same level of control. During our migration, we switched our management team for infrastructure in the cloud. So that had an impact on our managed security services and our RACIs that we had defined. That made some challenges for us. We ended up choosing to use Amazon Managed Services to manage some of our infrastructure, and they were a challenge from us, and we were one of their first customers. So again, the MVP seemed to be a driver there. Post-migration, if you recall early on, I said one of our golden rules was centralize all our logs. Since we've made some changes in our environment, our logging strategy is no longer centralized. We have S3 buckets in each account that collect the logs and then are forwarded to our SIM and UEBA tools, user behavior analysis tools. As I mentioned, we're still working on this dev and sandbox environment strategy. Let me talk about the next generation. So I'll start with the bottom, and that kind of drives the logging change and the other change that was on the previous slide. We changed our strategy from mimicking our macro segmented data center environment to going to a workload account strategy. So now every workload gets 3 Amazon accounts. They get dev, test, and prod. So we've gone from 20 macro segmented prod, non-prod, PCI non-prod, DR, to now I originally estimated 200. We're still in the transition process and at about, I don't know, 120 or 130 different Amazon accounts now. So in that process, of course, infrastructure as code and automation are key. You can't manually set up 120 accounts. What we've realized out of this, that strategy that we saw at Amazon and at Reinforce, and we also talked with another company here in town. They were already going down that path. What that gets for us is a cleaner concept for doing chargeback based on the account and the workload. And we also get to implement the microsegmentation piece that we had difficulty with in the macro account environment. We're still working on immutability on our assets. We're real close to that as we speak. An EC2 gets spun up, and after 55 days, if it's not been respun up, it'll get shut down. Chargeback, I think, is a future for us. Haven't hit it yet, but the environment's there for us. We are looking to move the language around disaster recovery, which is what our regulators are focused on, to that of resilience. So we'll continue to work on that environment using auto scaling and availability zones and all of that. So what's next for us at Sallie Mae? Well, we're working on our app modernization strategy. As I mentioned, we're going from 20 macro segmented accounts to 100 or so. We did that lift and shift, but now we're working on rebuilding, re-architecting, and revising, and in some cases, replacing our existing applications. We have had one or two that we've replaced already. On the security side, we did most of this. We already moved many of our solutions out of on-prem into cloud SaaS, or replaced them with different solutions. Let's see. So getting close to the end, if you're going through this process, I'm hoping that you don't hear these because they're definitely not good. It's too hard. So we'll get to that later. Can I have an exception and put that on the backlog? And oh, is that S3 bucket public? Hoping you don't ever hear those in your process. Make sure that you have good, strong governance and compliance there. All right, so I'm at this point open for questions. Got about 4 or 5 minutes available. I will turn that back over to you if you want to manage the question side. All right. Let's see. All right, I do have some questions. Let me see if I can get through those. All right. We've got, what are some of the things that AWS load balancers didn't have? Something that AWS could add as a feature. We used iRules in doing some scripting within the application. We also used it in doing some security prevention things. Those might be available in Shield environment in AWS, but we did find that there were some features of F5 that weren't available. If you're further interested in that, Joe, then please let me know and I'll have a follow-up with our cloud engineering team. Cloud custodian, it can help with cost management. Yes, we did do some evaluations on the cloud management platforms. At the time we did that, they did not seem mature enough to put in as part of the process. I think that's an annual review for us, and we'll be up next. Tagging is so important and powerful. Thanks for calling that out. You're welcome. Tagging is critical. And making sure that you have accurate tags is also important. All right. Of the types of Rs, what has been the most painful and in what way was it painful? Well, in our Rs, we're in the process of trying to determine how do we re-architect and re-implement. So we're definitely taking a serverless or containerized approach. In those particular areas, it's a skill issue. So how do we learn the skill? Back to that sandboxing environment. How do I have the right sandbox so they can learn the skill so that they can get it into the process? We've also found that in some cases, for some of our requirements, not all of the native solutions meet all of our requirements. So we're still buying some either marketplace apps or customizable SaaS apps to sit on top of that. So it's not a all-in to native everything concept for us yet. In the future, looking out 5, 10 years, we can see that multi-cloud environment where workloads are ephemeral and can shift between different cloud providers. We're a long way from getting there. One of the drivers for us is making sure that we are not locked in. So we continuously look for any of these solutions that we put in place to see what the lock-in is and try and prevent that. Hopefully that answers your question, David. How do you keep tags up to date? So we have automation that allows us to modify tags. Tags are created when an asset or an instance in AWS is created. So there's defaults basically in the creation process. Going back, that's probably a manual process for us today. Thanks for the question, Greg. David asked another question. Do you feel the nature of scopes is changing to become much more involved in day-to-day compared to previously it was approved to deploy and then respond to incidents? Okay, so as I mentioned, I might not have mentioned, but one of the changes we made just prior to moving to the cloud was we also changed our application development teams from waterfall to agile. So we're still in that love-hate relationship with agile and in the cloud and maintaining our regulatory compliance and service management, change management, and approvals in all the different areas. So while it is becoming quicker to build systems and quicker to make changes, it's not an immediate response. Question from Todd. How many servers were involved in the lift and shift? How big is the cloud team? The rough estimate was approximately 1,000 servers that were migrated over. We have 2 different cloud operational teams. We have a cloud operational team that's in charge of operational issues and middleware. And then we have a cloud engineering team that sits on top of that, doing VPC flow logs and EC2 AMIs and security configuration, implementation, those types of things. The way that we're keeping that number of team members lower is to make sure that we're using automation. We use Ansible and infrastructure as code, so that if a new system is spun up, it's automated, created, and configured correctly using IAC. Let's go to the second to last question from Shane. What was the riskiest part of the move and how did you mitigate that risk? For us, it was making sure that our regulators felt comfortable with us going to the cloud. And that took a long period of time and many different meetings to ensure that they felt comfortable, and walking them through the process and showing them our security golden rules and framework that we're implementing. As part of the process, they were definitely active. We had auditor assessments as part of the process that our regulators rely on. So in that perspective, making sure that our control environment was also up to snuff and meeting all the different controls and evidence gathering as we moved over to the new cloud. Last question. Are you able to talk at all why the company shifted from Azure to AWS, technical differences or business decision? I think, Joel, good question. I think the primary driver on that, once the tech differences were ironed out and AWS convinced us that we could spin up the servers to meet our .NET environment just fine and integrate with our ADO, then it was really a business decision based on the cost model. So as you can imagine, we chose the cheaper model that also better fit our future desires in doing development. We wanted to develop in AWS native and go serverless.